the cycle, because it's not hot and because it's not wet, there isn't really a cool down period though. So even though the cycle itself may take a similar amount of time, it might be in the chamber only for say 45 minutes, 30 minutes. But whenever the chamber opens up, the instruments are immediately available for use.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On this week's episode of First Case, we are continuing our path of the instrument reprocessing lifecycle and following our trays from the time they leave the OR until the time they make it back to the OR for another patient. And we are going to be speaking with Bobby Parker, who is the VP of Clinical Solutions at Beyond Clean, and we are talking all about sterilization methods. What are they? What are the different ways we can sterilize our instruments, and what kinds of instruments need different types of sterilization? There's a lot that goes into sterilization because everything can't be put in a steam sterilizer and just be called sterile. There's so many different types of instruments who need different types of attention and different types of sterilization. And we're going to talk about all of that today with Bobby. So don't go anywhere. We will be right back with Bobby Parker.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to First Case.
Joining us now is Bobby Parker, VP of Clinical Solutions at Beyond Clean. And I think it's about time we have a Beyond Clean representative show up behind the mic for this season of Sterile Processing 101. So Bobby, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Glad to be back, Melanie. It's been a little while since I've gotten to talk to you First Case people. So, thanks for inviting me on the show.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we get to talk to you today and that we've gotten to talk to so many sterile processing experts in this season, because that is, I guess, maybe the other world to us. It's the world that those of us in the OR don't fully understand, especially on a conversation like today when we're talking about different types of sterilization. Those are the things that get brought up and we're like, what are you even talking about? I've never heard of ethylene oxide or glutaraldehyde or all of these other chemicals or, flash versus IUSS and all of those things that just get confusing for us and we don't really understand, but they are so important to making sure that our instruments are sterilized properly, that we're doing the right thing, and that we have safe instruments for our patients. So I'm excited to learn more about the sterilization methods today and talk to an expert in the process. So before we get started, why don't you I know you've been on the show before and we've talked before, but everybody might not know who you are. So would you just introduce yourself to everyone for me?
Well, sure. And before I do that, I'll do my best today, Melanie. We know a decent bit about sterilization in SPD, but I'm no chemist, right? So I'm gonna do my best. That's right. I'm operating on a high school chemistry class and just reading sterilization books. So it'll be fun. We'll work through it. I also want to comment that I hear that you did me dirty. That last week you had Kevin Anderson on, and that guy is a genius. So thanks for having me be the very next episode. Anyway, well, yeah, my name's Bobby, which I didn't need to say. Off to a great start here, and so I host the podcast over at Beyond Clean. We love doing sterile processing education, making it available for folks for free on your phone, in your pocket. I've been in sterile processing for about 15 years or so. Started as a technician, have worked as a supervisor, a department manager, and then my role at Beyond Clean has primarily been kind of a clinical educator type role. I type a lot of PowerPoints, do a lot of education, and talk a lot behind this microphone. So that's a small window into what I do for fun.
Well, you do a really good job at all of that too. Like, if any of you listening ever get an opportunity to hear Bobby speak, to watch him on a webinar or anything like that, you should do it, because Bobby, you really are a really good educator, and you do a really good job of making these topics understandable and ways that we can relate to them and learn. So just to prop up your ego a little bit before we jump into this conversation, but You do an excellent job. And,
before we've had the episode. So well, thanks for setting the bar high. We'll let the audience decide.
They will decide, yes. Well, and here we are. We have been this whole season talking about the life cycle that our instruments go through, from the point of use treatment that we are responsible for in the operating room, and then following those instruments as they leave the OR, all the way through the sterile processing department to different areas, and then ultimately getting back to our operating room. And last week we talked to Kevin Anderson, and we looked at inspection and assembly and maintenance, and he had some terrifying stories about things you find with borescopes and just all of the responsibility that really is on the shoulders of our sterile processing techs as they're inspecting those trays. But they've gotten ready, they've gotten inspected, they've put them together, and now it's time to sterilize them. So when we're talking about sterilization, I think it's best that we really do start with the basics. So what is sterilization?
Well, it depends on what you mean.
Yeah.
Technically, sterilization is the process of killing all microbial life on a surface. So no more bacteria, viruses, fungi, spores, nothing survives the sterilization process. Why I say it depends on what you mean is we tend to describe the action of what we're doing as sterilization. Like sterilization is putting it inside that box and pushing the button. Like that is the function of sterilization. But what's interesting about that is to achieve sterilization, you do actually have to successfully kill all the microbes on those instruments. And the only way we can know for sure that's happened is by swabbing the instruments and testing to see if it's sterile. So in our context, what we mean by sterilization is whichever process or method or lane we use to accomplish the conditions that would achieve sterilization, which would be no microbial life left on the surface at all.
And there's other words that get used and thrown around when we're talking about our instruments and the processes they go through. And sterilization, obviously removing all of that microbial life. But we also hear terms like cleaning, like disinfection, and then obviously sterilization. And they all mean very different things, although sometimes people use them the wrong way. So what's just quickly like that difference in what's happening between cleaning, disinfection, and then sterilization?
Yep. So each of those terms, you're right, they do have a different meaning in this context, and they do get thrown around interchangeably out in, Walmart.
Yeah.
Sanitization, sterilization, disinfection, and you just, kind of chuckle about what they mean. But generally, cleaning is that process of removing soil from the instrument. So that's usually what's going on in decontamination when the instrument's being washed. I assume that since you're doing an overview of the whole show that you've talked about cleaning, so I won't go too deep into it, but just removing all visible, and the definition also includes non-visible soil. You're trying to get all of that off of the instrument. Then from that point, you might still have microbial life present on the instrument. And so the process of disinfection goes from removing soil to killing remaining microbial life. And so disinfection and sterilization are neighbors, and that way they both have the same goal. It's just how far do you take it? So disinfection has different levels. There's low-level disinfection, and then there's intermediate level, and then high-level disinfection, and then the step just past that is sterilization. So disinfection would destroy most microbial life on an instrument, save maybe some very difficult to kill spores, bacterial spores. Sterilization just takes it one step further and is more rigorous so that it would kill even the most difficult to kill spores and leave no microbial life left on the instrument.
And it's good that you brought up high-level disinfection too, because there are some instruments or some pieces of equipment in our department that can only have high-level disinfection, right? We can't sterilize them. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So the way you decide what level of disinfection you need has to do with how it's going to be used. So, something as simple as a stethoscope, or maybe the handle that you're going to use for your laryngoscope or something like that, it may be approved to just only come in contact with non-intact skin, and it's just going to get a wipe down with a low-level disinfectant wipe. Things that go into a patient but are maybe going to come in contact with a mucosal barrier but not enter a sterile part of the body, from a risk perspective, it's appropriate to do high-level disinfection on there, which is, again, like sterilization, but might not take care of some of the most difficult spores. And then those instruments that are going to come in contact with an open wound, blood's going to come in contact with a sterile part of the body, those have to be sterilized. So in an ideal world, we would just sterilize everything, right? Because that's the safest situation. But there are some instruments that can't handle the sterilization process. I'm thinking particularly of those large diameter flexible endoscopes that they use down in endo for doing like a colonoscopy or something. The majority of those scopes can't handle the sterilization process. And so we high level disinfect them, which is appropriate for their use in just about every case, because they're not going into a sterile part of the body. And so we go with high-level disinfection. But with surgical instruments, we'd need to sterilize those, of course.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And, sterilization, it's going into an open wound. It's going into a sterile part of the body. Obviously, we don't want to transmit anything dangerous, any microbe or anything, viruses, whatever, into our patient, which actually brings up the point that, yes, we're talking about sterilization, but sterilization actually depends very much on effective cleaning so that we can thoroughly sterilize our instruments. What happens if an instrument goes into the sterilizer that still has something on it?
Well, very practically, Melanie, I guess I'll turn the question around and ask you, the OR nurse in the room, like, practically what happens when that happens,
Right,
the instruments are flung across the room, the room gets torn down, right? So the reason that creates such a hullabaloo in the OR is because you've got, you now have doubt or question of whether or not the instrument is sterile. So that debris on the instrument, the line of reasoning goes that that debris could shield that portion of the instrument from getting contact from the sterilant, whatever sterilant you're using. And so underneath that dirt and debris could be some existing and living microbial life. And so we reject it as if it's pathogenic, even though we don't really know. In fact, this could be a very interesting conversation. There was a study in years past where they looked at some sterilized residual bone on some surgical instruments and tested it and found that all of it was in fact sterile.
Really?
Yeah, right. And so it's shaking all the categories for what we're comfortable with. Yeah, exactly. It gives you kind of the yuck. Now, that's not to say it's a good idea just to use instruments with debris on them, because the bottom line is we don't know. And so you shouldn't use something if you don't know that it's sterile. And then there's other considerations as well about foreign debris. Like, you can drop a sterile foreign object in a patient and it still cause significant complications for them. So because it's not pathogenic doesn't mean it's not hazardous to the patient. So you got to get the cleaning done. The adage that we use all the time in sterile processing is, if it's not clean, it's not sterile. That cleaning done and decontamination really sets the foundation for the whole rest of the process. If you don't get it right at that cleaning stage, none of the rest of it's going to work.
Absolutely. So now let's dive into this part of this conversation that I think that those of us in the OR feel the most lost. So we're going to talk about sterilization methods, and there's several different ones out there. And so I guess let's just start there. What are the different options if we're going to be sterilizing instruments? What are the choices that we have?
All right. So my background is primarily in the hospital. So I'm going to start with what, like a hospital SPD might have in terms of options, and then maybe throw in a couple other ones as a bonus. So the majority of sterile processing departments out there in a hospital are going to have steam autoclaves. Steam it's available in every facility because we use it for our boilers and hot water and all of that. So it's easily accessible, it's cheap, and it's wildly effective at sterilizing instruments. And so that's the lion's share, 80% of the instruments, I just made that number up, but 80% of the instruments that go through the department, they're going to go through a steam autoclave, and we can dive deeper into that. There are also some low-temp options out there because there might be some instruments that can't handle the hot, wet, high pressure conditions of a steam sterilizer. So those low temp options are typically like a hydrogen peroxide sterilizer or an ethylene oxide sterilizer. Most apartments these days are using hydrogen peroxide. There's back in the 80s and 90s, the OSHA put out some kind of scary stuff about ethylene oxide and causing cancer in humans and things like that. So so the market moved pretty quickly. Yeah, the market moved pretty quickly towards hydrogen peroxide, but there are still some ETO, ethylene oxide sterilizers out there, and there are safe ways to operate those. So those are the main ones between steam and then low temp options. If you're working in a research facility, you might find some other peculiar ones like an ozone sterilizer.
Yeah, I've heard of that one.
If you worked in maybe a dental facility, you might have a little tabletop sterilizer, and that could either work either through creating its own steam and a little steam autoclave, or there are some that just operate by dry heat, like your oven at home. You just cook it for a really high temperature for a really long period of time. So those are all the main strategies we have: is steam, dry heat, and different forms of low temperature chemical sterilization.
So then let's look at steam, because steam being the lion's share of what we do. How does steam sterilization work? And then what are the usual kinds of instruments that we're sterilizing with steam?
Yep. So the name of the game with steam sterilization is heat transfer. Mm-hmm. It's not a chemical reaction in a steam sterilizer. It's actually a physical one. We're trying to get these microbes hot enough that it will denature the proteins or the DNA structures in the microbes so that they're dead and they can't reproduce. And I say dead with quotes around it. Like, you can kill bacteria. You actually can't kill a virus. You can deactivate it because it's not a living thing. But the idea is get it hot enough to where it's going to it's going to denature whatever it is that's on that instrument. The interesting thing about it, the standard temperature that's being used in the steam sterilizer at your facility is not even as warm as the temperature in your home oven when you're baking chocolate chip cookies. And that is because, that's right, 270 degrees for the steam sterilizer, and then probably 325, 350 for your chocolate chip cookies. Yep. The reason for that is steam does a tremendous job at transferring heat from one place to another. That moisture in there does a very good job of that. An illustration of that at home, if you open up your oven and just kind of hover your hand inside of there, you can feel that it's pretty warm, but you can keep your hand there for quite a while. If you boil a pot of water on the stove, though, and you hover your hand in that steam coming off of that pot of water, it hurts fast. Like you can make it maybe a half a second. And so because of that and how effective that is, we're able with steam sterilization to sterilize instruments in a matter of minutes. Whereas if you had a sterilizer like a dry heat sterilizer, you'd have to go up to, north of 500, 700 degrees for, an hour or more. It takes a tremendously long period of time to transfer enough of that heat into the microorganisms, but steam does it very quickly and very effectively.
Yeah. And what is the amount of time in the sterilizer that it has to be exposed to that temperature for the steam to be considered effective?
Yep. So you have to follow the manufacturer's instructions. We have validated instructions provided by the people who made the instruments that have been tested to show that can produce a sterile instrument. And every instrument has its own set of instructions. That being said, here in the U.S., all of those tend to be grouped around the same set of standard cycles, typically at 270 degrees with this fully saturated steam for an exposure time of 4 minutes, which is about double what it takes to kill the most difficult spores. So at that temperature and at that pressure, you can pretty well be assured that all the microbial life is going to be dead after 2 minutes. And so we sterilize it for at least 4, just to make doubly sure. A big margin of safety in that steam sterilization process. But then there are some random instruments that are made in a different way, or they're really complex, or they were just made by a manufacturer that has trust issues, and so their IFU says that it has to be in there for 20 minutes of exposure, and so sterile processing has to follow that. We've got to follow whatever the manufacturer recommends.
Okay, so this might really be a dumb question, but I'm going to go with there's no dumb questions, and I'm just going to ask it anyway. If it only has to be exposed at 270 degrees for 4 minutes, why does it take so long in the sterilizer?
That's right. SPD, you must be so slow. The guy on the radio said that you can do it in 4 minutes. Yeah, so the big issue is, so water, it does a great job at communicating that heat and transferring it from the steam to the instrument. But that's not the only thing water does a really good job of transferring. It also is a really great pathway for microorganisms to move through. And so because of that, if you have a package that gets wet, then we reject it in the OR, right? Because that water can become a pathway through the packaging to the instrument and can contaminate the instrument. So we want cool and dry surgical instruments for storage, but the steam sterilization process is very hot and very wet. So at the end of that 4 minutes, the sterilizer will start a drying phase, which is going to try to hold those instruments in that sterile state that we just accomplished in those 4 minutes, but dry all of the water out of the tray so that whenever you open the sterilizer, what comes out are really hot but really dry instruments. That drying phase typically lasts around 30 minutes, sometimes 40. Again, just have to follow the IFU. So then you pull it out of the sterilizer. Now you have dry but really hot instruments. And so you can't do something with it right away, because if you take something really hot and set it on a cold back table in the OR, it's going to condense, and that water, again, is going to become a risk for contamination. And so we have to let it cool all the way down to room temperature before we can handle it. So that process can take anywhere up to 2 hours or so, depending on the type of instrument. So yeah, 4 minutes in the exposure phase of the cycle, but it takes a little bit of time to get up to that exposure phase. You've got about a half hour of drying and then up to a couple hours of cooling after the drying. So it takes a little while to get the instrument ready for use.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And then obviously this is the bulk of our instruments, but just a few examples of what we're throwing through the steam sterilizer. What are those instruments?
Yep. All of your run-of-the-mill stainless steel surgical instruments, your scissors and hemostats and whatnot, all the big orthopedic loaner trays that come through for all of those knee revisions and hip revisions that come in, 15, 20 trays at a time. Yep. All those are going through the steam sterilizer. And then oddly enough, some complex devices are able to go through there. Your battery operated powered drills, even some really delicate rigid scopes end up going through the steam sterilizer. Not all of them, but some of them. But pretty well anything, if it says in the IFU it can go through the steam sterilizer and it's not going to hurt it, SPD's sending it through that steam sterilizer because, again, it's really reliable, broad margin of safety, the thing works, and it's cheap.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Okay, that really does help explain the steam cycle and the steam process. But we also have instruments that go through low temperature sterilization. What's going on with low temperature?
Yep. So again, you've got some instruments that can't handle that high temperature, high pressure situation. So you put them in a low temperature sterilization chamber. So rather than counting on heat to denature those microorganisms, we're relying on chemical reactions. And so the sterilization comes from whatever chemistry you put in there. If you're putting in ethylene oxide in an ETO sterilizer, that process is called alkylation, which I don't know, college chemistry classes. I would go look it up. And then a hydrogen peroxide sterilizer uses a process called oxidation, which is, I know a little bit more about that because that's the type of sterilizer that we use. But essentially, the gas chemical that is in this chamber is stealing electrons from all of these molecules in there, and it renders them dead or ineffective. The thing to note about the low-temp sterilization, since it's depending on the chemical process instead of heat, the chemical actually gets kind of consumed or used up as the sterilization process goes. So sterile processing has a lot more considerations about how to package things up in there, how much can go in the chamber. They have to be careful about those things because, like in a hydrogen peroxide sterilizer, very famously, you can't put any cellulose products in there, no paper, no towels, because it'll soak up all of the sterilant in there and react with the paper. And then there's not enough to go around to get the instruments sterile.
Okay.
Yeah, so you have to be a little pickier about that. Same reason with everything that goes in that low temp sterilizer, at least for hydrogen peroxide, has to be super duper dry because, again, that water gets in the way of the chemical sterilization process. So It works. It's very effective, but it's a little bit more dependent on the user getting it right. And sterile processing departments often grumble about how much their low-temp sterilizer fails. And most of the time, it's because the person loading the sterilizer or putting something together in prep and pack included something that wasn't supposed to go in there, or the instrument wasn't all the way dry, or something like that. The cycle, because it's not hot and because it's not wet, there isn't really a cool down period, though. So even though the cycle itself may take a similar amount of time, it might be in the chamber only for, say, 45 minutes, 30 minutes. But whenever the chamber opens up, the instruments are immediately available for use.
Oh, that's
so
nice.
That's an upside to it.
Yeah. And what kind of instruments are we talking about? What are some examples of those?
Yep. So primarily going to be flexible scopes, like if you use a flexible ureter scope or something in the operating room that needs to be sterile, that's going to go through one of these sterilizers. And then other things that are delicate that can't handle the high temp, high steam, or high pressure of the steam. Things like maybe your orthopedic batteries or some of your other scopes or power equipment. Yeah.
Okay. And then there is one other type of sterilization, or at least a term that we talk about. And sterilizing our instruments this way, we used to refer to it as flashing, that taboo term that we don't talk about anymore.
Yeah, we don't say that F word around
We
here.
don't say that F word. No, none of the spicy F words on this podcast. But anyway, we have, and obviously we've really moved away from using that type of sterilization at all, but we do still hear about it, but it is called IUSS now. And I think that really does more accurately represent what's going on. But let's talk about that for a minute. What is happening with IUSS, and when can we use it, or should we ever use it?
Right. Yeah. So nothing magical is happening in that machine. If you're using a small sterilizer near the operating room and you're mystified as to how we're able to get some instruments out of this thing in 15 minutes with a little 4-minute exposure time, it must be doing something super special in there that doesn't happen. It's not. It's the exact same cycle as the steam sterilizer down in sterile processing. The only difference is because it's going to be used immediately, we don't really care about storage, which is why we cared so much about that long drying phase and that really long cool down phase. But for immediate use steam sterilization, it's something that's going to get used immediately. So we're transferring those instruments directly to the back table, piping hot and all the way wet, and using them immediately. So there isn't anything risky necessarily about IUSS as a process in terms of it getting sterile. The risky part of it is the sterility maintenance piece of it. Because we don't have a cool, dry instrument, there's an increased risk that in the transfer to the back table or during the procedure that instrument's going to become contaminated. And so that's what all the bugaboo is about, of trying to limit the amount of immediate use steam sterilization that is done. In the context of your second question about when is it okay to use it, we generally want to reserve that for documented emergencies. Anytime that you don't have the option to use a terminally sterilized instrument, meaning a cool and dry one, you may have to use immediate use steam sterilization. And your facility is really going to want you to demonstrate that the reason that you're using it is a true emergency and not something that you planned for. Like, it's not an emergency to say, well, we had 8 of these cases scheduled. We only have 6 of these instrument sets. So every Tuesday, we're just going to have to immediate use sterilize 2 of them because we just don't have enough instruments. The plan there is, get enough instruments so that you're not depending on IUSS as a process. The other important one that needs to be talked about is we don't ever IUSS implants. Again, there's nothing unique or magical about how implants need to be sterilized. We can get them just as sterile in an IUSS sterilizer as we can down in SPD, but that added risk of potentially recontaminating it during the procedure or transferring it to the back table just has significantly bigger consequences for the patient if it's an implantable device. So we shouldn't ever be IUSS sterilizing it unless, again, it's a documented emergency where there's no other option made available to us. And so it's recommended in that case you inform the surgeon, let that surgeon make a clinical decision and document that like crazy.
And also, is it also true that if you're going to do IUSS or use IUSS on an instrument, you can't just pick it up off the floor and go throw it in the autoclave. Like, it still has to go through whatever cleaning process it should have gotten before it gets put in the IUSS. Well, what do I call that? Before it gets put through that cycle, correct?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm glad you brought that up. And that was one of the big motivators for changing from flash sterilization terminology to this IUSS. There were really two big changes. One is we wanted to do away with the days where we just rinse it off in the scrub sink and throw it in an open pan, right? It needs to go through a full reprocessing, just like any other instrument. The only thing that we'll be cutting out is the dry time. We need to send it over to SPD for decontamination, even though it's coming right back to the OR to go into the sterilizer. The other big change that they made with IUSS is that it needs to be done in a rigid container system that's been validated by the FDA for immediate use steam sterilization. So again, gone are the days where we had that little open flash fan where the instruments just open to the air, because again, the big risk with IUSS is that transfer to the back table. So we don't want somebody holding this hot pan with tongs open to the air, trying to elbow around people through the sub-sterile and taking it into the back door of the OR. We want it to be in a rigid container system so that at least we can get it right next to the back table and then open it up and have that instrument there. So those are the two big changes, is full reprocessing and approved rigid container system.
I love that you brought up rinsing it off in the scrub sink and throwing it in a flash pan, because that, I cannot tell you how many times I have possibly done that exact thing. But
we leave
honestly,
those stories in the past, Melanie. We don't mention those things.
We don't tell these stories, right? But honestly, and I hate to say it, it's what I was taught to do. And I didn't know that it wasn't okay, obviously, until I was educated and found out otherwise. And that's the same with anything, right? You don't know what you don't know. And then suddenly you're like, oh, that's not okay. Like, we don't just rinse this off and throw it in a flash pan and it's okay. Like, it still has to be, all of the cleaning and all of the decontamination process has to be followed. And yeah, I don't know how long, how many times, just countless times that did happen. And so I think it is good that we've changed from this idea of just flash being just quick, get it back on the back table, to actually following a process that's going to ensure maintain sterility for our instruments when they have to go through that cycle. But yeah, it's not just because it's convenient. It's not just because you don't have enough trays. And we have a sign at my facility, the sterile processing department is you just go down the hall and kind of up a little ramp, and then you're in their department and whatnot. And there's a sign there that actually has this whole checklist for IUSS. Do you have to IUSS an instrument? And basically it's like, no. But then you go back through and you really have to justify every single thing. And at the very end, did you call, the manager or the director and really, explain what's going on and really get approval? Because there is really a big push to make sure that we aren't using this as a constant source of sterilization for our instruments, right?
Right. Yep. And we've kind of come full circle around the conversation of cleaning. That's why we don't rinse it off, is we want to remove not only the visible soil, but the non-visible soil before it goes through that disinfection or sterilization process. So, yep, that's why that's so important.
Absolutely. Okay. So they've gone through whichever mode of sterilization, okay, low temperature or steam, however it is that we are going to sterilize these instruments. Well, then they come out. What are we looking for when they come out of that sterilizer so that we can verify that sterilization parameters have been met or that sterilization has occurred?
Yep. So we call this process sterility assurance. And I mentioned it before, but we can't know for sure that instruments are sterile without opening them up, taking them down to the biology lab and having them swabbed and checking for microbial growth. And by the time you do all that, the instrument's not sterile anymore. You can't use it. So rather than having that, we have some tools in place that give us some assurance of sterility. Some sterility confidence measures, we could call them, instead of sterility assurance, if you want, so that it can help us be confident that the instruments are sterile. And so the primary one that everybody's familiar with are these sterility indicators. You put an indicator inside the tray right next to the instrument, and that indicator is designed in such a way that it will only change color or advance the little bar when all of the parameters necessary to achieve sterilization or sterility have been met. And so when you open up your tray and you see that indicator right next to your instruments on the inside that has passed, you can feel at least confident, like, okay, these instruments went through a process that was capable of achieving sterility. And that's the most we can know about. It gives us assurance that the instruments are sterile, even though we don't scientifically know for sure. And when I say we don't know for sure, it doesn't mean that we can't be confident, because we can. In a proper rigid container system that's been properly maintained and that instrument has been kept in the right environment, it definitely is sterile. But there are things that could happen to that tray that might hurt our sterility assurance. So if you're using a rigid container system, there's a giant ding in the side of the lid such that you can actually see a little bit of a gap down into the rigid container, then you should not feel good just because there's a past indicator right next to the instrument, right? So we need to be checking our trays to make sure that the packaging is appropriate. There's not holes in our wrapper, or the seal of the rigid container actually, the lid fits on the base of the container and things like that, in addition to checking that there's an indicator on the inside. We also put an indicator on the outside. So the rigid container have those little locks with a dot on the outside, and then our wraps have some indicator tape over the seam that change colors. Those external indicators are there just to help you visually distinguish between a tray that went through the process and a tray that didn't go through the process. But that indicator is not as robust as the one on the inside. So you could actually get that steam tape to change color by throwing it next to your cookies in your oven at home. It's just measuring to see, did it go through a sterilizer? But It's not measuring, have all of the necessary parameters for sterilization been met. So in an instance where you open up a tray, it's got the locks on it, the little dots changed, but SPD forgot to put the indicator on the inside, you can't say, well, the external one was on there, the instruments are good to go, because it's not a substitute for that internal indicator. So
I have had that conversation before.
Yep. So you can tell I have as well. So
yep.
Yeah, so those are the main ones that you're going to experience in the OR. Then inside SPD, we have one more that we use called a biological indicator. And that's a little glass vial that has real live bacterial spores inside of it. And we picked a spore that's like really, really hard to kill with steam sterilization. And we include it with the load. And then after the sterilizer comes out, we incubate that little vial of bacterial spores and see if it grows. And the thinking behind that is, if we can sterilize this vial of nearly impossible to sterilize spores and we get no growth, then whatever was on those instruments is going to be fine. It's the old adage from that movie Dodgeball. Like, if you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a ball, right? Like, if you can sterilize the spores, then the instruments are fine. So we use that in SPD, but you won't see that in the OR.
Yeah.
That's just something that we do internally to make sure that the instruments are sterile and that the sterilizer is doing its job.
Yeah. Off the record, what's the name of that spore?
Geobacillus staurothemophilus.
Okay, well then I am going to ask you, now that you know it, because we actually had to know that on our certification exam, what the name of the spore was. So anyway, okay, so let me back up then, since you do know the answer. Okay, so you bring up the spore that's really, really hard to kill. And surprisingly enough, when I was studying for my CNOR exam, and I had to, study all the sterile processing ins and outs and sterilization methods and whatnot, they wanted us to know the name of that spore. So for anybody else who doesn't know what that spore is, what is the name of that spore that you are killing?
So we really are doing science class today, aren't we? So it's called Geobacillus staurothemophilus. So two really big long words. Geobacillus, that tells you like the shape and type of bacteria we're working with, and staurothemophilus, I don't know what all of those bits are, but it has thermo in it and philus in it. So like heat loving. It is a spore that thrives in hot environments, which is why it's one that's difficult to kill with steam, because the strategy again is to try to cook it, and it likes that. And so if you can sterilize that spore with steam, then you can sterilize the rest of the instruments. We also pick it because it's not pathogenic. It's not harmful to humans. And so, if somebody accidentally breaks one open in SPD, they're not necessarily going to get sick from it.
Hey, wow, you are... Hold on, how do I say that? I'm throwing you for a loop with the chemistry questions, but these are the things we have to know to be certified, but also it's helpful to understand the process and really know what's happening to our instruments. And the process is more in depth than just, throwing an instrument tray in a washer and then popping it in a sterilizer and then hoping for the best. Like, there is so much more in this process. in the OR, we just don't put as much thought into it, I think, as we should. And so it's good to have these conversations. So we have rapidly come to the end of our time today, which always goes by too quickly. But before we go, is there anything else you want to share with our audience about the sterilization process before we wrap up today?
That's a good question. You're doing basics, covering myths and misconceptions, and I was thinking through the different misconceptions about sterilization, and I think we've covered the main ones. Like one that we can know for sure that it's sterile, which we can know that it achieved a state of sterility at some point, but we can't know whether or not the thing was cleaned appropriately beforehand or if the packaging was right. We have all those sterility assurance measures. The thought behind it that sterilization ought to happen really fast, like it's actually a pretty time-consuming process. Or another funny misconception is that SPD just kind of has a button that they push. So vendors will show up with this brand new device that nobody has ever seen before, and they say, just sterilize it like everything else, right? You guys sterilize all kinds of things. You know how to sterilize things. Just do it that. And it's almost like opening up a recipe book that just gives you the ingredients and says, "Hey, cook it like everything else." There's a lot of variability there, and sterile processing is not in the business of inventing their own ways to sterilize things, because to say something's sterile and ready for use on a patient, that's a legal declaration. We're following validated instructions from a manufacturer. So that if something goes wrong, we're leaning on that manufacturer's validations to prove that it's sterile, because we're not doing validated studies and microbiological swabs of instruments to prove sterility and things like that in sterile processing. All that happens out at the manufacturer. So instruments get sterilized in a number of different ways, and then it's not quick. It takes time. So if you get irritated at your SPD saying it's not ready yet, it's still cooling down, that's why, because they want to make sure that tray doesn't get wet. So
and we want it to take time because we want it to be right and we want it to be safe. So all right, so you mentioned it already, but tell us again, if people want more education and they want to dive deeper into a lot of these topics, what does Beyond Clean have that they can take advantage of?
It's a good question, and it's funny. I was thinking about it. We are also doing a myths and misconceptions season right now.
Really?
At the moment. Yeah, we are. So it's funny timing. We're talking about much more specific topics, but we also got into point of use treatment and transport. So all the episodes over on Beyond Clean are CE approved for sterile processing. So we would love for folks to tune in there. We also have a very broad spectrum of attendance at our virtual conferences. So we do full day SPD conferences that touch on some topics from the OR as well. And so we would invite folks to participate in the conferences and webinars and things like that we do. And then last one that I'll throw out there, we also have a little weekly short segment called Ask a Clean Freak over on Beyond Clean's website, where we just invite anybody out there who has an instrument reprocessing related question to ask it, and then I post a little short video response on social media. So if you have a particular instrument question and you don't want to go listen to a bunch of podcasts and you just want to know what that guy Bobby's opinion on the matter is, feel free to submit that on there and make me squirm on the internet trying to answer
Oh, that's great. Go ask your really hard questions, see what you come up with. Right. But I think I've thrown enough hard questions at you today. So, Bobby, thank you for helping us with this topic today. And you made it understandable, and you made it where we could really relate to it. So I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. That was Bobby Parker, VP of Clinical Solutions at Beyond Clean. And there is so much that goes into making sure our instruments are sterile. I think I've said this every single week at this point. But every conversation, I'm blown away with just how in-depth it really is and how much work it is to really do the process right and to really ensure that all of the steps are followed. And when it comes to talking about actual sterilization with steam, with low temperature, whether ethylene oxide or hydrogen peroxide or some of the other methods that they have out there, these are things that we don't learn the ins and outs of it. We just expect the product to be sterile when it gets to the OR. But then when we sit down to study for a certification exam, suddenly they want us to know all of these details and we panic because I just don't know them, and we don't get taught them. So these are helpful conversations to have to actually learn what's happening, what is going on, and what is the process that make sure that our instruments are sterile and safe to use. So, and Bobby is such a good teacher and really helps you really understand the process in a way that we can relate to. And like he said, Beyond Clean has so many resources available. You can go to beyondclean.net. You can check them out. They have a podcast as well that's all sterile processing, and Bobby is the host. So if you enjoyed today's conversation, go check him out and listen to his podcast and learn more from him. And they, go deeper into the sterile processing world, really understand what's happening. It'll make you a more well-rounded OR person for sure if you know that aspect of our instruments care. But that is going to do it for this week's episode. Stay tuned. Next week, we are going to be talking with Adam Okada, and we are going next step in the process, looking at those indicators, integrators, the tape, the filters, all of those things that are on our trays that are communicating information to us. And we're going to be looking at exactly what they're telling us and what they're not telling us, and finding out how that just is one more step in the process to ensuring patient safety. So stay tuned for that next week. But on behalf of everyone here, thanks for listening to this week's episode of First Case.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to First Case on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for First Case in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. We look forward to hearing from you.